Hello and welcome to Unit 3 of your course on World Literature and the Global City. This is the final unit of the course, and it has the two texts that I'm most excited about working on. China Miéville's The City and the City, and K.W. Jeter's Noir, which we're just reading some extracts from. I just wanted to briefly talk about some ideas that I've been thinking about in relation to the city and the city today, and also spend a little bit of time just talking about the video presentation, which is due next week, because I've gotten a lot of questions about it, and a lot of the questions are essentially just expressing a general sense of anxiety about how to approach it, rather than nobody who has gotten in touch with me about this has said anything that makes me think they're not going to be able to do it, or that they're really genuinely lost. There's just a sense of I'm a little bit afraid of doing this all wrong, and you're not going to do it all wrong. So I just want to talk a little bit about the amount of latitude you have in terms of what you're doing in that presentation. But just to begin, I wanted to talk about speculative fiction. So Unit 3 is going to focus on speculative fiction and imaginary cities. So we're moving from where we looked at the global north in New York in Unit 1, and the global south in Unit 2, where we're looking at Joburg and Mexico City, and Dhaka. And now in Unit 3 we're going to look at imaginary cities and thinking about how writers use imaginary cities to both reimagine the present and also to offer critiques of that present, and to unearth the sort of contradictions that sustain the way that we live in cities today. As you'll notice, both of these novels are examples of noir, or examples of detective fiction. And like a lot of detective fiction, like Raymond Chandler and people like that, it focuses on a kind of male protagonist who is sort of distant and unemotional, and they're presented with a mystery and they're trying to sort of solve that mystery, which involves exploring the city, and it often involves exploring the kind of underbelly of a city and the less desirable aspects of it, in order to solve a mystery. And many people have posited that this is quintessentially urban fiction. It responds to a sort of anxiety or a need among readers to make sense of increasingly fragmented, increasingly violent, and increasingly difficult to negotiate cities. That if you have a very tough, unemotional protagonist who is able to explore these sometimes quite frightening areas of a city and make sense of them and piece them back together, it's not just the murder that's being solved, but also the mystery of the city. That in some sense it gives us a sense of control over our own encounter with the city. That's one theory of why detective fiction is, first of all, so often associated with cities, but second of all, why it's so popular. We've already seen one novel on the course that can be read as an example of detective fiction, and that's Zoo City by Lauren Bukes. And a good few of you have looked at how that novel uses a female protagonist to explore the city, and how that might differ from the sort of male vision of the city that we've had before. What's interesting also in that is how it in some ways upends our expectations of detective fiction, both in terms of having a female protagonist, but also by having a very sort of powerless protagonist, relatively speaking. She has a special power, but she is very much a marginalized figure. And so her encounters with the city are not so much going into the underbelly as coming out of it. Now, Miéville is doing something a little bit different, obviously, than in Zoo City, but it does have some sort of interesting intersections with it, and I'm glad to see that some people are looking at exploring the intersections between those two novels. But I wanted to look at not just detective fiction. Like Mieville is using detective fiction as a genre, and he pays huge amount of respect to the genre. But he's also playing with it, and he's playing with our expectations of the city, because quite obviously he's piecing together a city that is divided in the most fundamental sense of that word. And there's this sort of tension in the novel when you're reading it early on, which I assume at this point you've all been reading the sort of early part of it, where you think, okay, so there's two cities here. Are they like they're in parallel dimensions or something? Occasionally you sort of see something from the other city, but then you unsee it, and then you're living in this like they're two spaces that are in different dimensions or something. And then you start to realize after a while that that's not what's happening. Everybody is sort of deluding themselves into believing that they're in one city, and there's another city that isn't there in front of their eyes, and they're learning, as he says in that very Orwellian term, they're learning to unsee the other city. If you're in Bessel, you only see Bessel, and you unsee Ulcoma. And there's almost comical moments where he's describing the idea of driving through traffic, and obviously you can't crash into traffic from the other city, so you see it, but you mentally unsee it. And I thought about this as being a very abstract concept, but of course, to some extent, we do this all the time in cities. We learn to unsee things that are inconvenient to our conception of the city. People learn to be very blind to the proximity of extreme poverty and extreme wealth. If you're extremely wealthy, it's quite possible to walk through the city without ever encountering the extreme poverty that's right in front of your eyes. We also see this in terms of what I would call linguistic cities. And I think Denton is a good example of this, where you've got effectively a bilingual city. It's got an English-speaking city and a Spanish-speaking city. And for a lot of people within that city, there is very little interaction between the Spanish-speaking and English-speaking city. And it's possible almost to believe that, for example, my perspective as a white person, that this is a white city almost, and a white English-speaking city. And I have lots of neighbors who are Hispanic and stuff, but it's like you can almost find yourself unseeing this whole other linguistic world that is right there in the same space as the one that in which I exist. So I started to realize that something that's happening in the city is he's rendering very, very literally something that is done almost as a sort of a reassurance, a sort of psychological mechanism that people put into place when they live in cities, in order to not have to encounter too much difference, in order to be able to feel sort of comfortable and insulated. We are often able to sort of psychologically exclude otherness and difference from our own experience. And I think Mieville is offering a kind of literalization and a critique of what that does and the psychological barriers that puts up. And he makes it into literal barriers that people have to go through, borders to cross over into this other world. And it's, of course, completely absurd. One person in the class is talking about working on the idea of breach in the novel as a kind of power structure and how that power structure exists. And everybody in the novel is very afraid of breach, that breach might, if you go into the other city, which means recognizing that the other city is right in front of your eyes, breach will come along and you'll be in lots of trouble, right? In some ways, I want to avoid spoilers here. So in some ways, breach is a literal authority, an institutional authority, but it's also a psychological mechanism, right? That people have internalized the idea that I can't see Ulcoma if I'm in Bessel. And this is this sort of echoes Michel Foucault, who actually gets a shout out in the novel. One of the Mahalia Giri's sort of work, her supervisor says she was very interested in Foucault. And Foucault is interested in the idea that power structures within a society often operate psychologically rather than literally. One of his great ideas, if you're not familiar with Foucault, is the idea of the panopticon, the idea that we live in a society that's akin to a prison, in which the prison warden can see every cell in the prison at the same time. It's not that he's capable of looking at any prison cell at any given moment, so that after a while, people in the prison assume they are being watched. Okay, so the example that's often given is at 1 o'clock in the morning, you stop at a red light, even though you know there's no police around and there's no danger in breaking that red light. We still stop at the red light. The idea is that you have internalized the idea of a power structure and authority, and we obey that. And in some ways, Breach seems to be an interesting literalization of that tension between real institutional authority and the psychological internalization of it. There's other things going on in the novel. I think there's echoes of real cities. As an Irish person, I'm very conscious of divided cities. I think of Belfast when I read Miaville's novel, that idea that there is an entirely different cultural structure to another Belfast. There is a unionist or loyalist Belfast with its sort of cultural symbology of Britishness, and an Irish nationalist side of the city with its symbology of Irish nationalism, and often it's divided by a literal wall, that they're part of the same city and they're, structurally dependent on one another, but they exclude one another from their everyday existence. And there are references in the novel that are clearly to Belfast, and there's also references to Berlin, especially the sort of Cold War references. Clearly the Olcoma is a kind of former Soviet city, and Bessel is very sort of West Berlin-esque with its sort of support from the United States and stuff like that. The interesting thing that seems to be happening in the novel is that both cities are in a process of change. We don't just see these static cities. We're conscious that Bessel used to be the more upmarket city, and it has now become more down at heel, and Olcoma has become this sort of hyper-capitalist city, even though it's a more authoritarian regime in charge in Olcoma. So there's a reference there, I think, to China as well, that China is a kind of ostensibly communist country with its trappings of authoritarianism and so on, but it has embraced consumer capitalism and combined it with that, so that democracy and capitalist affluence are not necessarily bedfellows. You can have an authoritarian capitalist society too. So there's lots of little things going on that I think are worth exploring. There's so many directions you could go in with this novel that I just think it's fascinating. What's interesting in a more general sense, and for the unit as a whole though, is that The City in the City and Jeter's novel Noir, which we'll be looking at next week, are both quite grim, right? They're both sort of depictions of nightmares in some way. I mean, this idea of Bessel and Olcoma is like a weird dream that you had. It's very disorienting to read. Jeter is much more literally like a nightmare. It's like Blade Runner, or that kind of dystopian vision of a future city that spans the entire Pacific Rim across all of Asia and all of the United States and all of South America and whatever. And the city is one that's defined by extremes of inequality, and he's clearly parodying aspects of American society, such as the healthcare system, which you'll see in one chapter that I've included, and the sort of debt structure of American society is also being satirized in the vision of sort of zombies, people who are being artificially kept alive in one region of this super city. The people who die in debt, who are kept alive to pay off their debts. It's a very sort of on the nose kind of satire. But what interests me is one thing that you guys were talking about a little in relation to Zoo City, which is the idea that these dystopian visions are not necessarily always pessimistic. They can, in fact, be quite hopeful. They can contain elements of hope. And two ways in which it can do that is, one is in imagining an alternative to the present, right? So there's a very frequent refrain in literary theory that we can more easily imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So this emergence of lots of dystopian and apocalyptic fiction and film corresponds with an inability to imagine our way out of the present, right? But it seems to me that a lot of dystopian fiction seeks to reveal the sort of contradictions that are there in our present world, whether that's contradictions of capitalism or of ecology or economics or social contradictions or anything like that. That it's sort of revealing those contradictions and often in the process imagining alternative possibilities, so that there may be a kind of optimism hidden within these very grim depictions. And I really liked what you guys were saying about that in Zoo City. And I think there's more to be said about it in relation to Miyafo and Jeter. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly talk also about the video presentation. Like I said, I gave you an extra couple of days to do it. I was a little bit late getting this video to you, so my apologies for that. I was on the road again. So the way it's going to be done, like I said, the assignment is meant to imitate a literature conference, right? And as I was just saying in an email to somebody a couple of minutes ago, literature conferences are a little bit out of date these days. What happens at a literature conference is usually you're in a panel of 3 or 4 presenters with an audience of however many people, and each person stands up and talks for about 10 to 15 minutes. And at the end of the 4 papers, the audience is allowed to ask questions about the research. So each of the speakers presents a little bit of the research they've been doing recently, presents their ideas or the argument that they're trying to make, and then they're asked questions. And a lot of people feel that this delivery mode is outdated, and if you are majoring in any other discipline or if you've given presentations in another discipline, you'll probably feel that it sounds a bit outdated. And you're right, and there are moves afoot to change that, but this is the format that we follow in our discipline for now. It is something that we can approximate in an online course, though. So by doing this sort of video presentation, we're imagining ourselves as if we're at a conference or we're in a panel and we're about to talk for about 10 or 12 minutes to an audience of people who share our interest in this research area. And you just want to say, like, this is what I've been thinking about in relation to these texts that we all kind of know. And here's some ideas that I have, okay? So oftentimes when people deliver these papers, they do read from a paper. They have a script written out, pretty much like if you'd written out an essay, a short essay, and we're talking like 1,000 to 1,500 words. I don't think you want to go over that because then you're over time. But some people will read directly from a paper, and especially if you're not terribly, most of you are not, you're not like totally comfortable with this material, you're not working on it as a scholar for years, so you probably will need the reassurance that I've got what I want written in front of me. But if you are doing that, try to avoid reading just into the page. It's one of the things that you find at conferences. Often grad students in particular will read directly from the page and they're looking down like that, and it's very uncommunicative. It's not very easy to engage with what they're saying. Read from it for sure, but try practicing reading from it a good few times, like 2 or 3 times before you record, so that you're a little bit more familiar with what's there and you can look at the camera or whatever and try to engage your audience a little bit more. The other thing that I would recommend doing is maybe keep the essay itself short. Normally, if I'm presenting a paper at a conference, if I have 15 minutes, I'll write enough for just 10 minutes. And that way, if I want to expand on anything or ad lib a little bit or just engage with the audience a little bit more, I can just break away from what I've written and say, well, this is something that I was thinking about in relation to that. You may not want to do that necessarily, but if you keep it shorter than the allotted time, it tends to be a good thing because you're obviously less likely to go over. If you're in a real conference, a chair might just stop you entirely, and it's the big problem I find with conferences with people who haven't given many papers, is they tend to overpack their work. And a lot of you in your presentation proposals, the feedback that I was giving was, you're doing a good idea here, but you're trying to do way too much. You're not going to have time in 10 or 12 minutes to cover like 3 novels or whatever. So don't try to cover too much material. Limit yourself and say, okay, here's a smaller thing that I want to focus on, and I'm going to do that. And if you have that sort of very limited scope of what you're doing, you're a lot more likely to stay under the time. Even if a chair at a real conference lets you go on over time, people start to get restless and anxious when you go over. And I think it's a worthwhile skill to learn, the art of limiting your speech and concision. People like concise, well-made points, and especially in papers where it can't be too ambitious because you don't have the time to do anything massively ambitious. It's a good idea to sort of limit what you're covering. The other thing I would say is try to limit the length of your sentences a little bit. If you tend to write in longer, more involved sentences, or if you tend to use a lot of theoretical jargon or verbosity or big vocabulary, try to limit that a little more as well. Keep in mind that your audience is watching this on a video. The last thing I would say, and this is the most important thing, is to remember you're among friends here. Everybody who will be looking at this video, except for me, is in the same boat as you. They're all other students in this class. You've all encountered this material at the same time. You're all kind of on a level, and you're all really good students, right? But you're all friendly with one another. I've seen this again and again in your interactions on the discussion forums and in the peer feedback. You encourage one another massively, and you've always been really positive, and it's awesome to see how helpful you've been to one another. It's really hard to get that kind of interaction in an online course. You've done it really well. So keep in mind that that's the audience that you're talking to, are a bunch of people who've been encouraging you all along. So don't be nervous about it and don't worry about it. We'll talk a little bit about the questions after you've done it, but basically after a conference paper has been given, the floor are then allowed to ask questions of the speaker, and usually those questions seek to challenge particular ideas somebody has had in the paper, or they ask you to expand upon a certain aspect of what you've said, or they suggest alternative possibilities or texts, or other avenues that you could go down with this, or things like that. Or they might just offer alternative perspectives, or even offer criticism of the argument that's been made in the paper. And like I said, if you're willing to challenge one another's ideas and take issue with each other, that's not a sign of somebody picking on you or being sort of mean-spirited. The best questions you get are the ones that force you to think about what aspects of your paper could be improved, what are the weaknesses here. So like, you are helping one another by challenging one another. So the Q&A afterwards, we'll run those as probably as a discussion forum, I think would be the easiest, so that people can sort of level their questions at you and you can respond to them in particular threads, right? And it's not exactly like being in a conference, but it's as close as we can get. And like I say, if you're, in terms of your development as a literary scholar, your ability to engage with people at a conference, to deliver a paper and to respond to questions, and your ability to ask questions, because you'll be getting a grade for that Q&A section afterwards. So the more willing you are to engage constructively with one another, the better your grade will be in that. I think that's a really good preparation for something that's really central to what we do as literary scholars, and in terms of how we establish communities of scholars. Conferences are really important to that. So one of the things the last thing I wanted to mention was that if you are really interested in giving a conference paper, a real conference paper in person somewhere, and if you haven't done it before, if you do want to do it, get in touch with me and we'll talk about the possibilities for where you might deliver a conference paper and what sort of possibilities there might be for doing that, or, because I think it's a really good thing and I think it's something that people should practice. And if you're into this stuff, I think it could be really beneficial. Okay, so as always, if there's any questions or anything like that, please feel free to ask, because I'm always here and I love answering your questions. I've really appreciated people's willingness to get in touch about stuff lately. When you were struggling with, a couple of people were struggling with the amount of work we had to do over the last week or so, and I did appreciate that people got in touch, because it forces me, first of all, it forces me to think about. So I got a question like, what does a literature conference paper look like? And I was like, well, it looks like a literature conference paper, because I'm so used to doing these things that it's sometimes hard for me to get my head around the idea that maybe this is an alien concept to other people. So it was good to force me to be like, okay, I have to describe the basics of what this looks like. So I appreciate that. The other thing that was really beneficial was that you were willing to say, this is too much, we need to take a step back. And I'm more than happy to move around the deadlines and stuff like that, and maybe change the requirements a little bit, because I want to make sure that we're all still getting the most out of this and we're all progressing as we should be and getting better. Okay, so that's everything. I'll be talking to you during the week. Thank you.